On the afternoon of June 3, 1974, a 34-year-old logger named Hollis Vance was working a stand of ponderosa pine near Turkey Creek in the Coconino National Forest, roughly 20 miles southeast of Flagstaff, Arizona, when a column of white light dropped out of a clear sky in front of his entire six-man crew, and Hollis Vance simply was not there anymore. It was, by every surviving account, an entirely ordinary Monday up to that point. The crew having started before 7 that morning to get ahead of the summer heat, working a contract for a regional timber outfit, thinning a stand marked for selective harvest along the creek's north slope. His foreman, Earl Whitlock, would spend the rest of his life describing the sound that light made, not a boom, not a hum, closer, he always said, to the sound of a held breath, and the fact that every chainsaw on that hillside, 5 of them running at full throttle a moment earlier, cut out simultaneously, as though something had reached down and switched off the entire afternoon at once. Hollis Vance did not walk out of that forest that day. He did not walk out the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. He walked out, alone, along a stretch of Highway 87 more than 60 miles from Turkey Creek, on the morning of June 8th, 5 days after his crew watched him disappear inside a column of light that left no burn marks, no debris, and no explanation that any of them, in 50 years since, has ever been able to give. I want to begin not with Hollis Vance the man, but with the crew itself, because unlike a great many stories of this kind, this one did not rest on the account of a single witness alone in the dark. There were 6 men on that hillside that afternoon, and 5 of them, according to statements Earl Whitlock gave to the Coconino County Sheriff's Office within hours of the disappearance, described substantially the same sequence of events. A column of light descending at what Whitlock estimated as roughly 40 feet in diameter, appearing without any preceding sound, aircraft or visible source, standing for what the men's estimates placed at somewhere between 8 and 20 seconds, and then simply withdrawing upward and vanishing, leaving the hillside in ordinary afternoon sunlight, with 1 fewer man standing in it than there had been a moment before. Whitlock's statement, which Renee eventually obtained in photocopy form, notes that all 5 surviving men were interviewed separately by the responding deputy before they had any opportunity to speak with one another, a procedural detail the deputy himself apparently insisted on, and that their individual descriptions of the light's size, duration, and behavior varied only slightly, well within the range Renee has since been told, by a retired sheriff's investigator she consulted decades later, is typical of honest, independently given eyewitness accounts of a genuinely shared event, rather than the kind of suspiciously uniform account that tends to suggest coordination or rehearsal. Sam Ruiz, the youngest man on the crew at the time and the only one of the 5 still living when Hollis's daughter Renee began her own investigation decades later, told Renee in a 2016 conversation that the thing he had never been able to shake was not the light itself, but the silence that followed it. A silence, he said, lasted a full 30 seconds before anyone on that hillside said a single word, as though all 6, or rather all 5 of them, needed that much time simply to confirm to themselves that what they had just seen had actually happened. Ruiz also told Renee that he had, in the intervening decades, spoken about that afternoon perhaps a dozen times at most, always reluctantly, and that every other man on that crew, as far as he knew, had done the same. None of them ever seeking attention for it, none of them ever varying meaningfully from what they had told the deputy on the very first day. The search that followed, conducted jointly by the Coconino County Sheriff's Office and personnel from the National Forest Service, is documented, at least in part, in records Renee eventually obtained through a public records request filed in 2014, 40 years after the fact. Those records describe an initial ground search of the immediate Turkey Creek area conducted within 2 hours of the crew's report, involving deputies, Forest Service personnel, and a hastily assembled group of local volunteers familiar with that section of terrain, followed by an expanded search over the following 3 days that eventually covered, according to the surviving incident log, an area of roughly 40 square miles of forest and canyon country, supplemented on the 2nd and 3rd days by a search aircraft from a nearby Air Force auxiliary field, a detail Renee found only in a single terse line item and has never been able to get any agency to elaborate on further. No trace of Hollis Vance was found. No boot prints beyond the tree line where the crew last saw him. No torn clothing, no blood, no sign that a grown man weighing close to 200 pounds had walked, run, or been carried in any direction away from that hillside, a fact that struck the search coordinator himself, according to a quote preserved in a brief item from the Flagstaff newspaper at the time, as, in his own words, about the strangest thing I've come across in 18 years of doing this work. The search was, according to a terse notation in the file dated June 7th, the day before Hollis reappeared, scaled back to a reduced patrol status pending further developments, a phrase Renee has come to read, after years of familiarity with how these documents are worded, as the closest thing to an official admission that the search had run out of ideas. Hollis Vance walked out onto the shoulder of Highway 87 at approximately 6:15 on the morning of June 8th, and was picked up by a rancher named Dale Kessler, who was driving into Payson for supplies, and who later told a local newspaper reporter, in one of the only contemporaneous interviews connected to this case that Renee has ever been able to locate, that the man he found on the roadside looked, in Kessler's words, like he'd been rode hard and put away wet, disoriented, badly sunburned on his face and forearms despite the fact that his crew described the weather at Turkey Creek as overcast for at least 2 of the 5 missing days, and, strangest of all to Kessler, wearing his own boots on the wrong feet, laced correctly but swapped left for right, in a way that suggested to Kessler either extreme confusion or, as he put it, that somebody else had dressed him. Hollis was taken to a hospital in Payson, examined, and released within 24 hours. The surviving discharge summary, which Renee obtained decades later, noting mild dehydration, sunburn, and a weight loss of just under 11 pounds, a figure the attending physician flagged in his own handwritten note as inconsistent with 5 days of simple wandering, given that a healthy man in that terrain, with access to any water source at all, would not typically lose weight at anywhere near that rate. Hollis Vance walked out onto the shoulder of Highway 87 at approximately 6:15 on the morning of June 8th and was picked up by a rancher named Dale Kessler, who was driving into Payson for supplies and who later told a local newspaper reporter, in one of the only contemporaneous interviews connected to this case that Renee has ever been able to locate, that the man he found on the roadside looked, in Kessler's words, like he'd been rode hard and put away wet, disoriented, badly sunburned on his face and forearms, despite the fact that his crew described the weather at Turkey Creek as overcast for at least 2 of the 5 missing days, and, strangest of all to Kessler, wearing his own boots on the wrong feet, laced correctly but swapped left for right, in a way that suggested to Kessler either extreme confusion or, as he put it, that somebody else had dressed him. Hollis was taken to a hospital in Payson, examined, and released within 24 hours. The surviving discharge summary, which Renee obtained decades later, noting mild dehydration, sunburn, and a weight loss of just under 11 pounds, a figure the attending physician flagged in his own handwritten note as inconsistent with 5 days of simple wandering, given that a healthy man in that terrain, with access to any water source at all, would not typically lose weight at anywhere near that rate. Here is what the available evidence, incomplete but persistent, suggests happened to Hollis Vance in the years that followed his return. He did not go back to logging. Within 4 months of his reappearance, he had sold his chainsaws and taken a job at a hardware store in Flagstaff, a decision that struck Earl Whitlock, who tried more than once to talk him back into the crew, as entirely unlike the man he had worked beside for nearly a decade. A man who by every account had loved the work and had never shown the slightest interest in an indoor job. A man who Whitlock said used to talk about retiring someday to a cabin deep in that same forest, rather than away from it. Renee, who was only 6 years old in 1974, but has spent much of her adult life piecing this story together from her mother's recollections and her own scattered childhood memories, says her father never again, in the more than 40 years he lived afterward, set foot in a forest for any reason, not to hunt, not to camp, not even to accompany his own children on a school field trip to a nearby national monument, a refusal her mother eventually stopped questioning out loud, though Renee remembers her parents having at least one hushed, unresolved argument about it when Renee was perhaps 10 years old, an argument she could not follow in detail, but remembers ending with her father saying, in a tone she had never heard from him before or since, that she didn't understand, and that he hoped to God she never would. There is a second thread to this story that Renee did not encounter until she began her records search in earnest in her late 30s, and it concerns a small object. When Hollis was examined at the hospital in Payson, the attending nurse noted in the margin of his chart, almost as an afterthought, that a small, flat, dark metallic disc, roughly the size of a $50, had been found in the coin pocket of his jeans and was, per the notation, retained by hospital staff for reasons the chart itself does not explain. The notation includes a brief physical description, smooth on one face and faintly ridged on the other, cool to the touch even after presumably sitting against Hollis's body for some portion of the missing 5 days. A detail the nurse apparently thought worth writing down despite having no obvious medical relevance. Renee has never been able to determine what became of that object, whether it was handed over to any law enforcement or federal agency, discarded, or simply lost in the ordinary churn of a small rural hospital's paperwork over the following decades. What she has been able to determine through a 2015 records request to the hospital's corporate successor, which had absorbed the original facility in a series of mergers throughout the 1990s, is that the portion of Hollis Vance's admission file referencing that object is, in the words of the response letter she received, no longer part of the retained record, a phrase that struck her, when she first read it, as a peculiarly bureaucratic way of describing something that should have been either present or explicitly noted as destroyed, rather than simply absent from a file that was otherwise, by the hospital's own account, fully intact. Hollis Vance did not speak in any detail about what happened during those 5 missing days for close to 40 years, not to Renee, not, as far as she has ever been able to determine, to his own wife, who died in 2003 still not knowing, by Renee's account, any more than the rest of the family did. He was not, by every description Renee has gathered from people who knew him across those decades, a withdrawn or visibly troubled man in any obvious sense. He held the hardware store job for 11 years, then ran a small equipment rental business until his retirement, coached a Little League team for 6 seasons, and was remembered by neighbors as, in one recurring word several of them used independently when Renee interviewed them, steady. But Renee's mother told her, in one of the last conversations they had before her own death, that Hollis had a habit, for as long as she had known him after 1974, of standing at the back window some evenings after dinner and looking out at the tree line along the edge of their property, not doing anything, not saying anything, simply looking, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch, and that she had learned, early in their marriage, never to ask him what he was looking for. It was in the winter of 2015, in a hospital room in Flagstaff during what both Renee and her father understood by then to be his final decline, that Hollis Vance finally told his daughter what he remembered of those 5 days, and what he told her, Renee has said to me more than once, was less a story than a scattering of disconnected images that he himself had never been able to arrange into any coherent order across the 4 decades he had carried them. He described a room, or something like a room, with light that came from everywhere and nowhere, similar in quality, he said, to the column that had taken him, though he could never say with confidence that they were the same light, or even that the room had walls in any sense he could properly describe. He described a sensation of being examined, not painfully, but thoroughly, in a way that made him think, he told Renee, of the way he himself used to run a hand along a felled log checking for rot before it went to the mill, an image Renee has said unsettled her more than anything else in the entire conversation, precisely because it was so specific, so drawn from his own working life, and so clearly not the kind of comparison a man borrows from a movie or a magazine article. He described, most clearly of everything, a single moment of what he called an exchange, though he was careful with that word, and repeated it more than once as though testing whether it was still the right one, in which he understood, without words being involved in any way he could describe, that something wanted to know what the forest meant to him, why he returned to it every working day of his life, and that he had answered, in whatever way answers were given in that place, as honestly as he knew how. He told Renee that after that exchange he remembered nothing further until the highway, and that he had spent 40 years since wondering whether his answer that day was the reason he had never been able to go back. Hollis Vance was not, by any account available to me, a man given to embellishment or invention. Renee describes him as practical, almost to a fault, for the whole of his adult life. A man who balanced his own checkbook to the cent and had little use, in her words, for anything that smelled like foolishness. He showed no interest whatsoever, before 1974 or after it, in flying saucers, ghost stories, or any of the paranormal television programming that became common household viewing across the following decades. And Renee recalls, more than once, her father leaving the living room entirely when a program touching on UFOs happened to come on, without comment, simply standing and walking into the kitchen until it was over. He never sought out other people who claimed similar experiences, never wrote to any investigator or research organization, never, as far as Renee has been able to determine in years of searching, told the story to anyone outside his own immediate family, until that final hospital conversation with Renee herself. A man inventing a dramatic disappearance for attention, Renee has pointed out to me, does not typically spend 40 years actively avoiding every opportunity the culture around him offered to discuss it. I want to be careful here about what this account does and does not establish. It does not establish that Hollis Vance was taken aboard any craft, examined by any non-human intelligence, or held anywhere at all for 5 days in June of 1974. It does not establish that the metallic disc noted in his hospital chart was anything other than a lost button, a washer, or some other mundane object that found its way into his pocket during 5 days of wandering an Arizona forest in a state of shock and dehydration. It does not establish that his lifelong refusal to re-enter the woods was anything more than an ordinary, if severe, case of trauma-driven avoidance following a genuinely terrifying and still unexplained disappearance. What it does establish, at least to my satisfaction, is a pattern that 5 independent witnesses corroborated within hours of the event itself, before any of them had the chance to compare notes or shape their memories to match one another's. A documented 5-day disappearance with a search radius of 40 square miles that turned up nothing at all. A reappearance 60 miles from the disappearance site under physical conditions. Sunburn without matching weather, weight loss without matching duration, that a treating physician himself flagged in writing as inconsistent with the simplest explanation available, and a small physical object formally logged into a hospital record and then, decades later, formally absent from that same record, without any documented explanation in between. I have spent a considerable amount of time now with Renee Vance's account, with the surviving portions of the sheriff's incident file, with the hospital discharge summary and its handwritten physician's note, and with the independent, unprompted recollections of Sam Ruiz, the last living member of that 6-man crew. I am not prepared to tell you that Hollis Vance was taken by a beam of light in front of his crew and returned 5 days later having been examined by something not of this earth. I am not prepared to tell you that the small metallic disc from his hospital chart was evidence of anything beyond an ordinary object misfiled and lost, as ordinary objects in rural hospital paperwork so often are. I am not prepared to tell you any of that, but I am no longer prepared to dismiss it either, because whatever else this story is, it does not behave the way an invention behaves. A fabricated account, especially one meant to draw attention, tends to grow larger and more dramatic each time it is told. This one has done nearly the opposite, staying small, fragmentary, and reluctant, offered only once, incompletely, by a dying man to the one person he trusted to simply hear it without needing it explained. There is one final detail that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this case. Earl Whitlock, in the same 2016 conversation in which Sam Ruiz described the 30 seconds of silence on that hillside, told Renee that in the weeks after Hollis's disappearance, before anyone knew whether he was alive or dead, the entire 6-man crew was quietly reassigned by their timber company to a different section of forest more than 40 miles away. A reassignment the company's own surviving payroll ledger describes only as operational necessity, with no further explanation offered to any of the men involved, several of whom, according to Whitlock, never worked that stretch of the Coconino again for the rest of their careers. Hollis Vance carried something for the better part of 40 years and then, in the last months of his life, set down as much of it as he could ever manage to put into words. What was the column of light that appeared over Turkey Creek on the afternoon of June 3, 1974, in full view of 5 working men, and where did it take the 6th? What became of the small object logged into his hospital chart and then quietly removed from the record without explanation? Why was his entire crew moved to a different stretch of forest within weeks of his return? And who made that decision, and on what authority? Hollis Vance walked out onto the shoulder of Highway 87 at approximately 6:15 on the morning of June 8 and was picked up by a rancher named Dale Kessler, who was driving into Payson for supplies and who later told a local newspaper reporter, in one of the only contemporaneous interviews connected to this case that Renee has ever been able to locate, that the man he found on the roadside looked, in Kessler's words, like he'd been rode hard and put away wet, disoriented, badly sunburned on his face and forearms, despite the fact that his crew described the weather at Turkey Creek as overcast for at least 2 of the 5 missing days, and, strangest of all to Kessler, wearing his own boots on the wrong feet, laced correctly but swapped left for right, in a way that suggested to Kessler either extreme confusion or, as he put it, that somebody else had dressed him. Hollis was taken to a hospital in Payson, examined, and released within 24 hours. The surviving discharge summary, which Renee obtained decades later, noting mild dehydration, sunburn, and a weight loss of just under 11 pounds, a figure the attending physician flagged in his own handwritten note as inconsistent with 5 days of simple wandering, given that a healthy man in that terrain, with access to any water source at all, would not typically lose weight at anywhere near that rate. Here is what the available evidence, incomplete but persistent, suggests happened to Hollis Vance in the years that followed his return. He did not go back to logging. Within 4 months of his reappearance, he had sold his chainsaws and taken a job at a hardware store in Flagstaff, a decision that struck Earl Whitlock, who tried more than once to talk him back into the crew, as entirely unlike the man he had worked beside for nearly a decade, a man who by every account had loved the work and had never shown the slightest interest in an indoor job, a man who Whitlock said used to talk about retiring someday to a cabin deep in that same forest, rather than away from it.